What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last couple of episodes, I discussed the accomplishments of the Jefferson administration and the evolution of the judiciary. I talked about the first war with the Barbary pirates and how that conflict enabled Jefferson to expand executive authority. I went through the specifics of the Louisiana Purchase, as well as the implications of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, the Corps of Discovery, if you want to give it the technical title. Finally, I talked about the Marshall Court in general and the implications of the Marbury versus Madison decision in particular. In this episode, I'm going to cover the significant events of the second Jefferson term, focusing in particular on the international conflicts with France and Britain that would ultimately lead to the War of 1812. I'll also discuss the Sally Hemings scandal that haunted Jefferson throughout the later stages of his life and what it meant for his legacy. But before I do all that, I'd like to ask y'all to please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. Subscribing really helps the channel grow, helps other people find it, and it's the best way to ensure that I get to do much, much more of this. So if you're enjoying what I've produced so far, if you found it worthwhile and valuable, please subscribe. And if you feel so inclined, spread the word. Tell your family, tell your friends, anybody you think might be interested in history. I think they'd get a lot out of this too. Of course, I'm a little biased, but I honestly think that. So please like and subscribe. Please spread the word. Thanks very much. Let's get to it. So as usual, I'm going to give you a list of the resources that I've used and give you a question to consider before I get into all of this information. The resources are largely the same as they have been for the most recent episodes. There is the American Pageant. That is a common APUS history textbook. There is also Give Me Liberty, another common APUS history textbook. There is The Art of Power, the John Meacham biography that I'm going to refer to regularly. Has a lot of details about Jefferson's life and his presidency in it, as you might imagine. There's also Empire of Liberty, the Oxford History of the United States series book that covers this period. The question that I'd like y'all to consider as I go through this is as follows. It's kind of a big and complicated one, sort of a couple questions wrapped into one thing, but here it is. What challenges did Jefferson face from Britain and France that led to the Embargo Act of 1807? How did the Act's implementation challenge some of Jefferson's most important principles, and was it ultimately effective in achieving the administration's goals? I'll say that one more time. What challenges did Jefferson face from Britain and France that led to the Embargo Act of 1807? How did the Act's implementation challenge some of Jefferson's most important principles, and was it ultimately effective in achieving the administration's goals? So think about that as I'm going through this. I think you'll get a lot more out of the episode that way. So the very first thing I'm going to discuss is the Sally Hemings episode, both because it happened, well, it was publicly exposed anyway, earlier in Jefferson's presidency than some of the other things that I'm going to discuss. And it was a big part of his life and kind of separate from the stuff that had an impact on Jefferson himself, on the Republican Party, on the country as a whole during Jefferson's second term. So Sally Hemings was one of Jefferson's many slaves. He had as many as 200 or so at a time. I think it hovered largely between about 120 and 200 from about the time of the Revolution to the end of his life. The rumors about Sally Hemings and Jefferson have been persistent for many years before anything was widely publicly reported. There were many visitors to Monticello, that's Jefferson's house on a hill in Charlottesville, Virginia, who remarked upon the striking resemblance between Jefferson and several of his younger slaves. Sally's mother, Elizabeth Hemings, was Jefferson's wife Martha's half-sister, who had been fathered by Jefferson's father-in-law, Martha's mother. It's difficult to know the statistical regularity with which slave-owning men had sexual liaisons with their female slaves, or how frequently they fathered children, because records aren't exactly voluminous for reasons that you might imagine. But it was talked about all the time. There are numerous accounts and innuendos about the regularity with which slave-owning men fathered children with their enslaved women. So much so that the legal principle known as partus sequitur ventrum, governed the instances in which it occurred. This meant, did this legal principle of partus sequitur ventrum, that the status of the child followed the status of the mother, and it also meant that slave owners had an incentive to father children with their slaves, as it would add to their human property holdings, as ugly as that is to even consider. You could effectively enrich yourself as a slave owner by impregnating your female slaves and getting more slave children out of that relationship. I'm trying to talk about this in an objective, academic fashion, but I have to tell you, it is very hard. I don't know how one can think about this situation and consider enslaved women having sexual relationships with their enslavers and not characterize it as anything other than gross exploitation at a minimum, and, to be really honest, sexual assault and rape. It is one of the ugliest parts of perhaps the ugliest thing humanity has ever done. And I have a hard time thinking about it, or talking about it, or reading about it, and not becoming really, really angry. And at the same time, really sad. It's a tough thing to imagine. And that's even though I know that some number of these relationships, although I have no idea how many, did become genuinely romantic, and the offspring of these relationships could have had much better lives than most who were born to enslaved women would have had. And I know that some number of children born to enslaved women got brought into the family. I don't know how frequently. And I'm sure there have been studies done that try to hint at it, that try to guess at it, or come up with numbers that sound reasonably accurate. But from what I know, it's pretty hard to do. None of that justifies it or makes it okay. But like most dynamics within human society that involve a lot of people and take place over a long period of time, it's difficult to paint slave owners having children with their female slaves with one brush and honestly think you've captured the whole picture. But very definitely, for the most part, sexual exploitation of African-descended slaves in the United States in colonial days was, as was slavery itself, an abomination. And it is shameful and awful to think about. Anyway, back to Jefferson. According to John Meacham, and to other accounts I've read about the situation, it seems that Jefferson began his sexual relationship with Sally Hemings while the two were in France together in the later 1780s. John Meacham writes that it was in 1788 or 89 that the affair of many years started, and he addresses the ambiguity of the relationship in his book. He questions whether there was genuine emotional feeling, or whether it was simply a slave master taking advantage of a severe power imbalance. I think it warrants mentioning that Sally may not have been 16 years old when this relationship began, when these sexual encounters began. So that's another thing that makes this really difficult to think about and to talk about. I think it's also worth mentioning that while in Paris, Sally at the very least had a conversation or conversations with Jefferson about remaining when Jefferson left, because she was free in France. Slavery had been outlawed there. And again, according to Meacham, and this is verified by at least one other source that I read, although I can't remember which one it was, Jefferson convinced her to return back to Virginia, at least in part by promising that any children he fathered would be free when they turned 21. I guess make of that what you will. That seems like a pretty paltry concession to me. I mean, why wouldn't you just free the children right away if you really cared? I mean, why carry on with this whole thing? I mean, I don't know. There's so many things about this that I find disturbing and frustrating. But that in particular, I think, tells you just how bad the power imbalance was, that it's even a possibility that this conversation is what persuaded her to return back to America and back to slavery. So there were rumors and innuendos for a long time, but all the rumors and innuendos exploded out into the open in 1802, when James T. Callender, who was a former Jefferson ally and who Jefferson paid to be one of his attack dogs in the press, Callender published a report that Jefferson had taken Sally on as a, quote, concubine, and, quote, by this wench Sally, our president has had several children. There is not an individual in the neighborhood of Charlottesville who does not believe the story, and not a few who know it, unquote. Callender did all this, he wrote this because he was angry at Jefferson for not helping him, Callender, to eliminate or reduce the $200 fine he was saddled with for being convicted under the Sedition Act. Callender was also angry at Jefferson for refusing to appoint him as postmaster of Richmond, Virginia, and further, that Jefferson seemed to dismiss him by sending him a paltry $50 for all his sacrifices to the Republican cause. That was how Jefferson planned to buy him off or shut him up or whatever. Callender, had been pardoned for his conviction, but had still served months in jail and was in dire financial straits, I guess, when he got out, and expected Jefferson and the Republicans to help him. After warning Jefferson of dire consequences without more support, Callender abruptly switched political loyalties and went to work for a Federalist publication in the city of Richmond. It was while employed there that he wrote the expose about Sally Hemings and revealed that Jefferson had paid him to attack Adams, Hamilton, and other Federalists in the partisan Republican press. This was after Jefferson denied being behind James Callender's work for the Republican cause, that Callender then provided letters that proved, yes, Jefferson did know me, yes, he did employ me and pay me to do this shit. That's why when you're engaged in dirty political business, it's always good to keep the receipts. Jefferson was mostly silent when the accusations came out, and they certainly did not prevent him from winning a landslide re-election in 1804. Jefferson did what could be called the opposite approach to Callender's accusations of financial impropriety against Alexander Hamilton in 1797, when Hamilton admitted to the Reynolds affair in a kind of astonishingly detailed pamphlet, so that Hamilton, could refute the accusations of corruption as Treasury Secretary. If you've seen Hamilton the musical, you know what I'm talking about. Coincidentally, funnily enough, it was Hamilton, writing under an alias, Phocion, who had first publicly hinted, not come right out and said it the way that Callender had said, but hinted that Jefferson had had these liaisons with Sally Hemings. This was in a series of essays Hamilton published again under the name Phocion in 1796. DNA testing eventually confirmed that Jefferson was the father of at least one of Sally Hemings' children in 1998. That's when the DNA testing was administered. And while I guess it didn't prove exactly that he fathered all of them, it seems really difficult to argue based on the existing evidence and the added DNA evidence that came much, much later that he did not father all of them. It's maybe the biggest single reason that I have a hard time thinking of Thomas Jefferson as anything other than a brilliant mind with some great ideas whose behavior and character did not always come very close to living up to those lofty notions that he constantly wrote about and talked about. Okay, on to far less gross and disturbing aspects of Jefferson's second term. Jefferson and the Republicans may have loudly protested the Jay Treaty of 1795 when it went into effect and decried it as an unmistakable evidence of a cabal among the leading Federalists to make the U.S. subservient to or a clone of Great Britain. But there is no denying the economic bounty it conferred upon many Americans throughout the United States. With Britain removed as an obstacle to American trade, commerce between Europe, European colonies in the Western Hemisphere, the West Indies in particular, and the United States exploded. This re-export trade, as it was called, involved American ships carrying goods between Europe and European colonies, while Britain and France fought each other almost constantly from 1793 to 1815. And it meant that the 40% of all American goods carried on American ships in 1790 rocketed up to 92% by 1807. And it was of a much larger volume of goods, $43 million worth of goods in 1790 versus $246 million worth of goods in 1807. The value of American goods imported and exported in 1807 was 6 times greater than it had been in 1793, and the ship tonnage in that time tripled. The United States had also become the largest carrier of neutral goods in the world by this time, by 1807. There had been some disruptions and difficulties during this time, to be sure, mostly owing to the U.S. being caught between Britain and France in one way or another. The Quasi-War, for example, with France, resulted in the seizure of many American ships and sharply increasing insurance rates, but the U.S. Navy was able to push back effectively, and along with privateers, they protected the shipping of the United States in the early 1800s. It's something I talked about in previous episodes. The British also attempted to interfere with American shipping in the early 1800s because some officials in London were becoming envious and concerned about American shipping competing with the British merchant marine. The British eventually invoked the Rule of 1756 that claimed wartime trade could not take place if it had not existed in peacetime. And this is a throwback to kind of mercantilist policies where the British and the French and many other European powers are trying to restrict the trade of their colonies. So the Rule of 1756 is trying to step in and stop American expansion into this European and Western Hemisphere trade that's going on still as all the fighting is taking place in Europe in the 1790s and early 1800s. Americans circumvented this rule of 1756 with the Broken Voyage, as it was called, the Broken Voyage method, in which they grabbed some goods from West Indian colonies, which belonged to France or Britain or whoever, and rather than taking them directly to Europe from there, which is where they were going to end up, they would stop in the U.S., they'd pay a duty that was eventually rebated back to them, and then make the journey to Europe. This allowed the U.S. to dominate trade between the Caribbean and Europe from 1795 to 1807, roughly. By 1805, however, the British had become concerned enough about being supplanted in the Atlantic trade by the United States that the Royal Navy began seizing American ships that were engaging in this re-export trade. The British High Court of Admiralty had declared that the Broken Voyage was no longer acceptable, and something like 300 to 400 ships were seized in 1804-05, although most were later released, to be clear. Behind all of this prosperity from the re-export trade, from the United States becoming this big commercial power in the late 1700s, early 1800s, all of this that contributed, by the way, significantly to the voting public's positive image of Jefferson, though he wasn't really a big fan of any of it. He didn't like the direction that he saw the American economy heading in. Jefferson was an avowed agrarian who believed white yeoman farmers, specifically white yeoman farmers, to be the most important segment of the American population. He understood the importance of commerce in making this class of people prosperous because you had to export all of this agricultural bounty somewhere. It wasn't going to be consumed entirely within the United States. But he did not want the pursuit of profits by those who did not labor, who did not actually harvest the food or raise the animals or whatever, to be the engine of American economic growth. And he had an active aversion to industry and manufacturing. Jefferson believed, that the British and other Europeans only undertook manufacturing because they ran out of arable land. They ran out of planting land where they could farm. I mean, that's nonsense, but that's what he believed. Jefferson also believed that the emphasis on shipping and finance, and perhaps eventually on manufacture, would not only be bad for the economic future of the country, of the United States, but that having a large portion of Americans involved in these pursuits, commerce, manufacture, would sap the moral strength of Americans and of Republican governance. It's kind of a weird thing to look back on now, although I guess maybe not that weird. But there was this notion that farming was this great noble pursuit and that it just built character somehow in Americans in a way that engaging in manufacture or finance or commerce did not. And Jefferson certainly was somebody who bought into that. The president wasn't alone in this either, as many other prominent Republicans, particularly the Virginia planters that had so much in common with Jefferson, tended to romanticize and emphasize their ways of life, their rural, agrarian, in their case plantation, not yeoman farmers. I mean, these wealthy plantation owners who had lots of slaves and never really worked a day in their life didn't have a whole lot in common with yeoman farmers, really, but they definitely cast themselves in the same light, particularly when they wanted to talk about it politically. They tried to romanticize all of this and put themselves, the yeoman farmers and the big plantation owners, in all the same bucket of the real Americans who were representative of what the country was truly all about. Sounds a little familiar to the rhetoric of some a little more recently, I think, if you think about it. Jefferson and Republicans more broadly were still also supremely suspicious of Great Britain and of supposed collusion between the wealthy northeastern elites and the British government, who they thought were trying to subvert republicanism. This is the merchants and bankers and so forth of the Northeast, many of whom were still Federalist. That's where the Federalist strength was, really, until the party totally collapsed. In the New England, New York area. And Jefferson and Republicans still believed that there was this conspiracy by those folks in the Northeast of the United States and Great Britain to take down republicanism and install a British government 2.0. Furthermore, Jefferson strongly believed in the notion that free trade was vital for the more peaceful, more democratic world he wanted to see emerge. And he was despised the idea of giving up the United States' ability to use its trade and production power as a bargaining chip that could force the hands, in his view, of countries like Great Britain without resorting to warfare. That was his big idea, was that the United States would, at that time, and very much into the future, be able to use its commercial prowess to force countries like Britain and France to bow to America's will, to do or not do what the United States wanted them to, because they were so dependent on selling goods to America and on buying raw materials from the United States. All of this stuff, all these ideas about Britain, about what the American economy should be, about the political scene in the United States, help to explain why Jefferson did not renew the Jay Treaty in 1803, despite Britain's expressed desire to do that, and it's also why he so resisted any further treaties, commercial or otherwise, with other nations as the maritime circumstances became increasingly chaotic and confrontational starting in 1805. He just had a big aversion to treaties in general and thought that they would fuck up his grand vision of a world only connected through trade agreements, not even trade agreements, but through trade. And that world would be a more peaceful, prosperous, utopian kind of place. I've talked about this before. However, things started to change in 1805, and a little before then, actually, as I'm alluding to. Though the British had stepped up seizure of ships in the summer of 1805, and though this had a significant impact on the U.S. economy, insurance rates, for example, and, shipping and American sovereignty generally, all of that stuff became more complicated. Seizing ships, though, was far less galling to the Jefferson administration, to Republicans in general, and to many Americans all over the country than the other practice that the British were engaging in, and that is impressment. From 1803 to 1812, something like 6,000, according to American estimates, according to British estimates, it's more like 3,000, American sailors were taken from American merchant ships, sometimes while sailing in American waters even, and forced into the British Royal Navy. That's impressment. Taking people from ships and forcing them into the Navy. Now, impressment can also apply to British citizens being pressed into the British Navy, but in this instance, I mean impressment, and going forward, I mean impressment to be forcing American sailors into the British Navy. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, future president himself, referred to British impressment of Americans as, quote, an authorized system of kidnapping upon the ocean. So people had pretty strong feelings about it. Jefferson and others could not help but interpret this practice, impressment, as a gross violation of American sovereignty, and Republicans all over the country saw it as indisputable evidence that the British were attempting to engage in a form of neo-colonialism. Once again, the British, were refusing to acknowledge the real independence of the United States. This is a continuing theme. I explained the election of Jefferson in 1800 through this lens, that Republicans looked at it through the lens of, now we're finally free of Britain, because we have a Republican, a good solid Republican, Jefferson, in the White House, and he's not going to capitulate to Britain the way these Federalists, who are like secretly British admirers, have done for so long. Well, they still felt they weren't out of the woods yet, the Republicans and Jefferson. They still felt like they weren't really free of British authority just yet. So, how did this happen? How did impressment of American sailors even become a thing? Two factors contributed to the British employing this practice. Number one, the British were engaged in an existential struggle with Napoleonic France, in which their best leverage over France was control of the seas with their naval power, and the great toll the enduring wars had inflicted on Britain meant that they needed every British subject they could possibly muster to serve in the Navy. That's number one. Number two, in the 1790s and early 1800s, the rapid growth of American shipping I discussed earlier meant that the United States Merchant Marine needed all the manpower it could get, and that resulted in many British subjects finding work on American ships. In some substantial number of cases, these were men who had actually deserted the Royal Navy, which was the claim that the British used to justify impressment of people on American merchant marine ships in the first place. That some number of the people aboard a given ship that they were stopping and searching had been soldiers in the Royal Navy and had escaped, and they needed to be brought back in. These factors meant that the British had a logical reason to search for British subjects aboard American vessels. Even Albert Gallatin, the Treasury Secretary throughout Jefferson's presidency and into Madison's presidency, acknowledged that perhaps 30%, or even more, even as many as 9,000 of the 24,000 sailors on American merchant ships were British subjects. That's a lot, right? So you can understand why the British felt that they had the obligation to search these American ships for British subjects, and especially for those who they thought may have deserted the British Navy. Additionally, it was very difficult to tell the British and American sailors apart, because they looked and spoke so similarly to one another. The U.S. attempted to issue certificates of citizenship to American sailors, but given the fact that these documents could only provide a description of the individual in question, obviously there weren't photo IDs at this point, they were vague and unreliable, these certificates of citizenship, and especially in the view of British press gangs. And I read stories about the fact that there were American citizens who would fill out one of these certificates of citizenship and just sell it to a British sailor who wanted to pass off as an American. And the British found out about this, as you might imagine. So the British officials in the British Navy, were pretty suspicious of these certificates, didn't really trust them. Consequently, the U.S. tolerated British naval ships stopping American merchant ships to search for British subjects. But by the summer of 1805, American willingness to suffer this kind of humiliating practice had evaporated, and it became an issue that the president and the Republican Party, more broadly, insisted on completely eliminating immediately. Impressment became, in fact, the single biggest issue for the failure of the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty, which you've never heard of because it didn't happen in 1806. That treaty was negotiated by James Monroe and William Pinckney, not to be confused with one of the Pinckneys of South Carolina, but they went to Britain and they negotiated with the British government to try to get some version of the Jay Treaty restored, basically. It was a means of renewing that treaty, the Jay Treaty, that had expired in 1803, and which Jefferson in particular was, as we've already said, pretty hostile toward. The treaty offered, in its final negotiated form, the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty, pretty considerable concessions to American sailors, easing definitions of contraband, which was a big point of dispute, like what exactly was okay to trade. The not okay to trade stuff is contraband, and the British wanted to have a much wider definition of it than Americans did for reasons you might imagine. It also ensured compensation for seized ships, did the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty, and it guaranteed non-interference in the East and West Indian trade. But the British refused to back off of impressment entirely, even though they did pledge to use, quote, the greatest caution when impressing British seamen and to give, quote, immediate and prompt redress to any Americans mistakenly taken. So it was a pretty good deal. But given Britain's unwillingness to back off impressment altogether, Jefferson did not even forward the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty to the Senate for consideration. He just kept it to himself. He also, did Jefferson, strongly objected to the treaty's stipulation that the U.S. give up the ability to engage in any sort of commercial sanctions, because he, Jefferson, very much saw America's ability to withhold access to its trade market as an extremely powerful weapon that would be an alternative to war. That goes with this whole theory about America's commercial power being the ultimate trump card for whatever more powerful countries like Britain or France might try to do to the United States. So this is how you end up with what becomes probably the most regrettable policy of Jefferson's entire presidency, the embargo. It was this line of thinking that would lead Jefferson to push his, quote, candid and liberal experiment in, quote, peaceful coercion. The embargo, however, would fail completely in its objective of forcing Britain and France to abandon their aggression toward American shipping. Britain and France both escalated their attempts to stifle neutral shipping in the Atlantic and any other advantages that their adversaries would have with, in the case of France, the continental system. That was its attempt to restrict trade with anybody who might trade with Britain, and the Orders in Council, which were put into place by Britain. That was Britain's policy of trying to restrict trade. Both sides, Britain and France, tried to punish anyone who traded with their enemy, although it wasn't very well enforced. There were all kinds of loopholes and leaks from what I've read, so it wasn't all that effective. Rejecting the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty, as Jefferson chose to do, was a turning point in U.S.-British relations, as the U.S. clearly decided to abandon any pretense of conciliation and made it clear that the country would assert itself against its former colonizer. The Non-Importation Act of 1806 was an initial, although modest, step toward depriving Britain of American goods and markets, and didn't really go into effect for quite some time after it was ratified. As I said, the Importation Act of 1806 mostly went unenforced and was designed to allow for more negotiation between the two sides. But then the Chesapeake Affair, in which an American warship was attacked by a British warship, the Leopard, for not allowing the Leopard to inspect the Chesapeake for suspected British seamen. Now, this is a little different because it's an American warship, not an American merchant ship. So the Chesapeake, a warship, refused what the British were trying to do, and the Leopard fired on it. A few people were killed. A few guys were taken by the British as deserters from the Royal Navy, and that escalated things considerably more between Britain and the United States. Jefferson and the Congress ordered preparations for war in the wake of this, including building up coastal fortifications, calling up militia and privateers. Privateers, remember, are the sort of like government-employed pirates, if you will, and bringing some naval ships back into action after a post-Barbary War hiatus. Shortly after the Non-Importation Act went into effect, the Republican Congress passed, and Jefferson signed into law the Embargo Act that cut off all trade with every state outside the United States. As Jefferson and Madison and many other Republicans saw it, the choices were embargo, war, or nothing. And the latter two, to Jefferson, Madison, and the rest of the Republicans, were unacceptable. The embargo was immediately unpopular, and the restrictions on trade led to a deep economic depression within months of the embargo's institution. Additionally, the embargo was not effectively executed, as there were all manner of loopholes and resistance to the measure when it became law. Retrieving property was one of the loopholes, like, oh, we gotta go back and get our stuff, so excuse us while we sail out and do some trading while we happen to be out. Ships blown off course, oh, we didn't mean to get into the British West Indies, we just got here from bad weather. There's massive resistance to it in New England, and it was just totally ignored in the Canada-New York border area. So much so that part of the country was considered in open rebellion by the Jefferson administration as the embargo was in effect. It was frankly shocking the degree to which the Jefferson administration abandoned its limited government principles. I mean, Jefferson was the guy who said that the big bad federal government was something to be feared and that he didn't want others to misuse. Well, he forgot all about that when it came time to enforce his baby, the Embargo Act, and he, Jefferson, and others around him gradually pushed for greater and more stringent enforcement of the embargo, going so far as to sign into law the Enforcement Act of 1809 at the tail end of his presidency after Madison had already been elected to replace him. And that effectively, the Embargo Act, the Enforcement Act of 1809, effectively authorized martial law to enforce the trade restrictions. This is by far, up to this point, the most intrusive the federal government had become in people's day-to-day lives. And I don't know that much of anything would touch it in the subsequent decades. Nothing comes to mind offhand. Of course, this was, as I already said, terrible for the economy. There was a depression, but just to give you some perspective on just how bad it was, exports plummeted from a peak of $108 million in 1807, just before the embargo went into place, to $22 million in 1808. The Embargo Act was so unpopular, in fact, that it rejuvenated the moribund Federalist Party and led to serious talks of secession in New England and New York, which were both really hurting badly from all of this. There were people who sent letters to Jefferson saying that they were starving. That I read one in particular that somebody wrote to Jefferson and said one of his kids had starved to death because of the embargo. And it's especially tragic because all of this amounted to a big, fat nothing in terms of the progress that it made. The embargo had no coercive effects at all on either France or Britain. American ministers in Britain remarked that it barely went noticed in the UK, and that makes sense when you think about it. The British had bigger fish to fry. They were in this gnarly existential fight for their lives with France, who they'd only just avoid being invaded by, and they were doing everything they could, hanging on by their nails, just to not lose this great continental struggle with the French in the early 1800s. So whatever we did was kind of just a passing concern from their point of view. The embargo was finally abandoned in March of 1809, just as Jefferson was leaving office and just as Madison was taking over as president, even though Madison wanted to keep it going. But it was so unpopular, he didn't have the support to do it. As Gordon S. Wood, the author of Empire of Liberty, which I've been using frequently for these podcasts, has noted, quote, "Perhaps never in history has a trading nation of America's size engaged in such an act of self-immolation with so little reward," unquote. That's his take on the embargo. Although I guess you could say never in history has a trading nation of America's size engaged in such an act of self-immolation with so little reward until now? Until 2025? I guess we'll see how it goes with the tariffs. I am not optimistic. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. That's all I have for this episode. Please like and subscribe if you have not done so already. I hope you enjoyed what I went through here. I know it was kind of a lot, but I wanted to get through all the major stuff in Jefferson's second term. So thanks for hanging with me. Take care, and I will see you all next time.